Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy of the People with just Stefan back after a long break. Ben has been very busy, and I mean, it'd probably be too much to say I've been busy, but I've been lacking in sufficient ideas or maybe slightly too busy to come up with the whole thing independently on my own. But I really thought I should get back into it, and the idea I had was wanting to talk about deconstruction. Deconstruction specifically within the fantasy genre of literature, and I guess more broadly TV shows and so on, and how that relates to the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings, still sits kind of above fantasy, kind of looms down upon it, and everything in some sense is reaction to Lord of the Rings. But I feel like we're in very much a cultural moment where there's never been so much demand for subversion of sure foundations, while those sure foundations themselves have never been so lacking. The cultural theme in our present moment seems to be a feeling of vindication for overcoming via deconstruction some alleged social fact, but mainly in the case where this thing has already been overcome or when the dominant forces of our moment already seek to overcome it. This is most clearly the case for something like with the family on the left, where you'll see people on the left being like, let's abolish the family, let's deconstruct the family, let's reconstruct the family, and as if that's some kind of radical statement instead of just something which is constantly happening every day, which either makes the task pointless or does nothing to serve hegemony. But I think something similar and interesting is going on with in the fantasy genre around Lord of the Rings, around less sometimes the actual Lord of the Rings and more kind of the idea of it, the concept of it. And to be clear, we're talking about literary stuff here, but the Lord of the Rings is not like the family. It doesn't matter ultimately in any real political sense, but not everything has to be about politics. I want to talk more and more about literary theory. I'm really interested in it. I think it's good for YouTube. And I'm not then implying that this is some deep, deep political point, but rather just we're talking literary stuff here today. What are we even trying to deconstruct when people try and deconstruct Lord of the Rings? I mean, to go back slightly, there's a lot of vitriol. I don't really understand why. There's a lot of vitriol against the Lord of the Rings online, especially the books, and normally by people who seemingly have not read them. Because when you hear people talk about the Lord of the Rings, I think it's basically the vitriol is because some person will say like, "Oh, the Lord of the Rings is obviously the best fantasy book series," and someone else will go like, "Oh, I don't want that to be the case. I want my favorite book series to be the best fantasy series ever." And so I'll say, "Well, obviously, Lord of the Rings can't be the best fantasy book series ever because Tolkien just spends all his time describing hills. Whenever they go past a hill, he has to describe every single hill, and it's all these just descriptions and descriptions. And maybe that was good back in the day, but like clearly now it's terrible and bad. And of course, it's completely false. If you actually read The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien will skip over massive amounts of stuff. There's a bit where they're coming up to Amon Hen after leaving Bree, where Tolkien writes something like, and then they passed 3 days in the rain. He does describe Amon Hen, but that's a very important hill. It's a hill of great history. It's a hill with a fortress on top, and most importantly, it's a hill that the characters go to. So yes, he's talking about this hill, but he's not describing this hill for the sake of the hill. The hill is integral to the plot. But I think often when people are attacking Lord of the Rings, they're not even doing that. They're attacking kind of a more broader kind of idea of concepts. Lord of the Rings is not about a farm boy who is the hidden inheritor of an ancient kingdom who must grow into the man he can be at the side of a wizard mentor so that he can take up the promised sword and free the kingdom from the shadow by destroying the evil artifact of the Dark Lord. All of these elements are present in the Lord of the Rings, but not in this order and not ascribed to one boy. Well, probably the one feature which isn't at all in the Lord of the Rings is the farm boy. The farm boy as hero becomes the kind of stereotype of the post Lord of the Rings, the allegedly kind of loyal to the Lord of the Rings fantasy literature. This innocent farm boy who must become the great hero, who has some hidden destiny and so on. But probably the closest thing to a farm boy in the kind of main cast of The Lord of the Rings is Samwise Gamgee, who is still like a man in his late 20s, early 30s. I'm not sure. Maybe he's in his mid 30s, actually. While Frodo is a gentleman in his 40s. Samwise, of course, is not actually a farmer. He's a gardener. And Aragorn, who is kind of the promised hero, has never farmed anything in his life. He grew up in an elven city and then went on to kind of wander the wilderness. So all of these elements, more or less, are present in Lord of the Rings, but they're not ascribed to a particular boy. What would actually be deconstructing the Lord of the Rings? Beyond peculiar and resented story elements, for instance, this hill concept, deconstructing Lord of the Rings has a great deal to do with the tone of the text. For instance, the rejection of the general historical reactionary perspective of Lord of the Rings that I've discussed in a previous podcast, namely the idea that things were better in the past, in like a strong ontological way. But notably, this is a two-sided thing with Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is reactionary, but also very much hopeful, and has a very clear and unambiguously happy ending. Some authors invert this by being progressive and hopeful, for instance, the works of Brandon Sanderson, which we'll discuss more later, while others retain the reactionary elements, that things were better in the past, or at least things are not getting any better, while focusing instead on the abolition of hope. The clearest case here being G.R.R.M. of A Song of Ice and Fire, which I would not classify as grimdark, but is certainly something which is the inspiration for grimdark, which again we'll discuss later. The loyal deconstruction. So there are various authors, like it's been mentioned in the comments, like Eddings, who take themselves to be doing that they are loyal to Tolkien, that they're doing something similar to Tolkien. But already these authors, in their kind of loyal interpretations of Lord of the Rings, take apart the structure of it. This is everything from integrating women into the central narrative, most clearly in The Wheel of Time, to combining the role of Frodo and Aragorn into one character, which we'll see in stuff like Eddings, before then dividing up. So first Aragorn, the role of Aragorn as the promised hero of the kingdom, blah, 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 and then Frodo as the questing hero who must destroy the artifact, are combined into one character, and then they're taken apart into many pieces. And that's when we get epic fantasy, where you have many, many perspectives. Obviously, Lord of the Rings has quite a lot of main characters, but there's only two perspectives, really. You follow the story of Frodo from after in Book 2 and 3, and then you follow the story of Aragorn and the people around him. Well, 3, I guess. There's also the Gandalf bit when they're briefly separated. With I've forgotten if it's Pippin or the other one. It's Merry that goes with Gandalf. Or is it? I can't remember. But what's notable here that demonstrate there's no need to actively deconstruct, as every process of revalorization, as in we want to make our own Lord of the Rings. In doing that, you're going to deconstruct it. You're going to reconstruct it. You're going to take it apart. You're going to do something else. Every reevaluation, every revalorization, every attempt to do something over again, in fact, takes that thing apart. It's like our memories. I don't know if this is actually true. I don't think it's actually a fact, but it was told to me, and I've long believed that each time we remember something, that kind of dismantles that memory, damages that memory. And what we then remember further in the future is not actually the facts of our original memory, but rather our continual reinterpretation of that memory. The last of the loyal Lord of the Rings inheritors before we went in a different direction, led by Song of Ice and Fire, Wheel of Time, had a female Gandalf 35 years ago, and yet having female-led fantasy is still it's a subversion of something. We're still told that, like, oh, what if the farm boy was a farm girl? It's something interesting and subversive and deconstructive. What do we have inside Lord of the Rings? If we are to deconstruct Lord of the Rings, what would come afterwards? What would take its place at the center of fantasy? The Song of Ice and Fire, which became a Game of Thrones and became television, which I must say, absolutely fantastic choice to call it that. Because obviously the first book is called A Game of Thrones. But to rename the whole series for TV, Game of Thrones, a brilliant, brilliant choice. And shows what, you shouldn't be too loyal to what authors want. Song of Ice and Fire, which became a Game of Thrones, was the only one which really broke into the mainstream, apart from Lord of the Rings itself. And the genre now revolves around A Song of Ice and Fire, A Game of Thrones, and the reactions to it. Notably, there seems to be far less interest in deconstructing A Song of Ice and Fire than Lord of the Rings, and the imaginary of the Lord of the Rings book, style book. The only attempt, which you might say is deconstructive of GRM and Song of Ice and Fire and so on, though it's never really explicitly said, is the idea of comfy fantasy, which, if you're not familiar, comfy fantasy is this strange sort of new micro-genre where you take fantasy and you basically remove all the stakes and remove any kind of grim or scary or violent part from it, and you have like an orc who runs a coffee shop or whatever. And that's taken to be a deconstruction of grimdark, but I would say, as we'll get onto later, I think comfy fantasy is more drawing out from romance fiction and from fan fiction. I should read Wizard of Earthsea again. So I read it in Syria. I read lots of stuff in Syria where, like, okay, I read it, but it didn't really go into my mind. It wasn't really a time for things to be going into my mind. The biggest pure fantasy series is in a fantasy series where the interest in it is driven by itself and not any adaptation of it, are the various works of Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson's works are radically, radically different from Lord of the Rings' works of literature. Sanderson's works, beyond being poorly written, are fantastically modernist in the sense that Sanderson systemizes magic and generally puts fantasy on a progressive liberal footing, exactly at the moment where the progressive power of liberalism is exhausted. Mistborn, his first big series, was framed as a series of books after the Dark Lord had won. And what does that allow you to do that you couldn't do in Lord of the Rings? Well, it means you can have a revolution against Sauron. And so they have a revolution against Sauron, and they institute, like, basically a constitutional monarchy, and then they all die, and then, like, there's a new god, and he's good, and he makes them into, like, democratic capitalists. It's quite a strange series. The disenchantment of fantasy. What does present in the works of J.R.R. and Sanderson, and those that inherit these two, is a fundamental disenchantment of fantasy, which should be absurd. It should be a ridiculous idea that we can have fantasy with the fantasy taken out of it. But that is very much what's happening in these authors. What Sanderson is presenting is not magic in the sense of some fundamentally graspable supernatural system, but a series of systems of alternative physics and metallurgy and things like this. So fantasy is then pressed by the combined force of cynicism and rationalization. And this unity of these concepts is found in the imposition of contemporary psychology, and especially contemporary accounts of mental disorder and illness on the subjects of fantasy. In the sense that, especially in the works of Sanderson, we see this character has the DSM definition of an anxiety, major anxiety disorder, or they have an exact DSM definition of depression, or a really, really medically accurate version of split personality disorder, and so on and so forth. It's worth noting, it's worth objecting to these portrayals of these hyper-contemporary psychologicalized subjects in fantasy, on the basis that these concepts should be alien to the subjects that they are applied to, because these subjects live in a society unlike ours, and so where are they getting these concepts and structures such that they behave in exactly these ways as prescribed by the DSM? How do they know that they have depression? But perhaps more, we should reflect on the fact that they really are. It's not surprising that these subjects, well, they're not really subjects, they're objects, I suppose, these characters in fantasy novels have depression, because they're written as modernist subjects, and they often live in worlds that are broadly modern. Nearly all medieval fantasy does not portray medieval worlds. They portray early modern worlds. At best, they portray kind of Renaissance worlds in terms of the amount of wealth and so on. Even J.R.R.'s work, Song of Ice and Fire, is meant to be deeply, deeply grim and horrid and so on. But it's showing a really quite high medieval Renaissance, kind of the end of chivalry, and they just don't have guns. That's the thing. They're we're medieval because we don't have guns. But obviously, in the late medieval period, there were guns anyway, so. Another author I discuss here is Joe Abercrombie, who wrote the kind of, I would say, the defining works of grimdark. But what's kind of most impressive about the works of Joe Abercrombie is his character work. He has fascinating, brilliant characters. But the realness and impressiveness of the subjects in and a similar story with the Song of Ice and Fire. We love the characters. We love being inside the heads of these characters. George Morn is really the master of the POV, perhaps even more than Robert Jordan was. But what's so fascinating and feels real and complete about these subjects is because they're familiar to ourselves as being like contemporary subjects. He's not showing these genuinely alien pre-modern subjects, and we're fascinating because they work in mysterious ways, but rather because they seem so real to us as modern contemporary people. They emerge out of a reflection of our time and our notions and our emotions, rather than any actual insight into the mind of a pre-modern person, which doesn't stop or diminish Abercrombie's work in any way, doesn't stop from being hugely impressive, but most of what he could be shown in literary fiction, with fantasy working to act as a justification for a violent situation and a malleable and chaotic political situation where you can place these minds, these damaged minds, or these fascinating minds within a malleable and chaotic political situation where they can justifiably do extreme violence and so on. But I think most contemporary fantasy in the style of Abercrombie and probably in the style of George Martin could just be literary fiction, which is set in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or a similarly unstable country with a great deal of violence, which has an unstable political situation, which has all these rival factions, has very clearly like not genuinely democratic politics, and so instead has this politics based on like the interaction between elites, which you see very clearly in Song of Ice and Fire. The fascinating character work there isn't really anything to do with fantasy. I don't think really it being fantasy allows anything particularly to be brought out, rather apart from the fact that it allows for this violent and malleable political situation. Damn, I got called tedious in chat. First time. Oh well. Malazan is the only fantasy work that is explicitly deconstructive in the academic sense, as in the author was deliberately engaging in deconstruction, but also harkening back to Homeric works, and thus adapts what I think is kind of the proper perspective you want to take something forward, which is when you kind of mix effort to kind of go forward with a grasp of the most reactionary elements. You go back as far as you can while you try and go as forward as you can. But I think even in Malazan, the author in large part is still bowing to modern psychology. There are some characters that break with this. I'm thinking of Karso Orlong, who is like a horrible, terrible, barbaric character who has a completely alien system of morality to any contemporary human. But generally, that's not what's happening in Malazan. A great deal of the plot and the internal reflections of the characters has to do with their contemporary, fragile internal dispositions. Even characters who are like gods and like, Malazan is, a series of gods have anxiety and this sort of thing. Where they have these it really humanizes the gods, but then humanizes them in a way which then they become very contemporary and ordinary in this way. Underhill asks, what about Terry Pratchett as pretty deconstructive? I wouldn't really count like satire. Because satire always exists, right? And satire requires this center to exist, right? You don't, when you're engaging in satire, you don't actually want to deconstruct the people that you're talking about, right? Because if you do that, then you're over. Your works stop making sense. Your deconstructive, your kind of satirical deconstructive stuff, it requires you laughing at the Lord of the Rings. Malazan, Book of the Fallen. Someone asked me to clarify in chat. I can post links. And in the broad sense, is a commentary on suffering. Malazan is explicitly from the authors. He said that this is a commentary on suffering, which again is a very contemporary thing to worry yourself about, or at least to write a whole series about. Why is there such a demand for this style of deconstruction of Lord of the Rings? The reasons, in large part, are market reasons. For those who are not brave enough to say that the work is like some great work, you're not allowed these days to say on the back of your book, My work is just like Lord of the Rings and the Game of Thrones, because it's just like taken as absurd. It's like taken as something as like saying, well, actually, my book's going to sell 1 million copies, but it's much more acceptable for whatever reason to claim to overcome through deconstruction some part of that world in order to sell. Especially because Lord of the Rings would not be published as is in the contemporary world. There's no chance that would happen at all. A bizarre thing I saw recently is there's a big published book that I saw in the bookstore, many copies in there, though maybe many copies in there because no one was buying it, which was fan fiction of 1984. It was just someone doing, and this is the subversive thing. What if we did 1984? What if we re-released 1984? But the perspective was a woman. The perspective was the woman that the woman that exists in 1984. Her, whatever her name is. I can't remember the name of either the character in 1984. But yes, there's a big published book now being like, oh, what if we retold the exact same story but from the perspective of a woman? Wouldn't that be incredibly subversive? Subversiveness without any actual subversion is the perfect mode for those seeking to sell in our would-be rebellious moment. People are very dissatisfied with the society we live in, and selling to people who are dissatisfied with the society we live in is important. It's important to sell to rebels when rebels become an increasingly large amount of society, especially when they these would-be rebels, are kind of like high information, middle class consumers who are often drive things, who are tastemakers, who are the ones that are recommending books to others. And as I said at the start, the demand for subversion has never been higher, while the supply of sure foundations that can be subverted has never been lower. There's also a demand for everything to become everything, for everything to be a total life solution, for fiction to be a total life solution, which is why Brandon Sanderson's works are often praised for their true portrayal of mental illness, because you'll be often discussions around Brandon Sanderson's work online goes something like someone being like, well, it's really tiring how Kaladin just keeps getting depressed again. Like, I really hate that. Like, he keeps going and he goes back. And then someone will be like, well, but that's a realistic portrayal of depression. And you'll be like, well, I don't care. I fundamentally don't care if this is a realistic portrayal of depression or not. And then that person will be like, well, actually, I'm depressed. And it being this real portrayal of depression has helped me. And I like to see myself represented and so on. And that's really kind of appealing in our present moment. I was just checking all the comments. That was the brief silence. Do you actually overcome anything when you do deconstruction? I think rather that when we deconstruct something, we're just eternally caught up in its orbit. As well, the deconstruction of Lord of the Rings has led to subsequent works being different from Lord of the Rings. It's not clear if any of the subsequent works are better. It's not clear that we've reached any higher stage of fantasy, or that even contemporary fantasy authors speak better to contemporary people. Song of Ice and Fire, being adapted to television, was enormously successful as Game of Thrones. But the Lord of the Rings movies were also hugely successful, and not just hugely successful for the common person, but they were also Oscar winners. I'm pretty sure the first fantasy, at least the first live action fantasy to win Oscars, maybe not, maybe that's complete bullshit. While the more deconstructive, reinterpretive portrayal of Lord of the Rings on a TV show, Rings of Power, has been a complete and total disaster. So it seems that the efforts to deconstruct Lord of the Rings have not succeeded in overcoming it, in bettering it, or anything else. I read Ender's Game, and often when I'm reading books, or at least I used to, I think I don't do this anymore, but when I read books, I don't really pay attention to the themes or the deepness of it, or attempt to really engage with it anyway, but just kind of shove it into my brain. And that leads to me reading very, very fast, but not much else. But it did lead to me when I read Ender's Game. I didn't see the twist coming at all, and it completely blew my mind, just as it kind of blew the mind of the character in the book. And that was an absolutely fantastic experience. So that's a lesson in not really paying attention to the stuff you read, I guess. You might be fantastically surprised. Where does fantasy go next? Where will fantasy go next? So the two big things I would say now are comfy fantasy, and much more than comfy fantasy. Comfy fantasy is a microgenre, while romantasy, which is a portmanteau of romance and fantasy, has basically shown the capacity to completely overtake the whole genre. And we'll not talk about kind of romantasy will just be fantasy, and then we can make up some portmanteau for non-romance fantasy. And a decisive switch here is that for the very first time, most fantasy readers are women. And obviously, well, women not obviously. It's also fact generally outside of a few genres that reading is now dominated by women, publishing is now dominated by women. Men just don't buy books anymore, or if they do, they buy like books written 2,500 years ago by Roman emperors, and basically women just kind of drive basically all fiction sales. Comfy fantasy is a reaction to grimdark. There's clear tabletop influence, but there is at least some part of the same kind of lineage from the Lord of the Rings. Romantasy, on the other hand, is notable for truly being post-Tolkien and genuinely genealogically separate from it. It often leans on pre-Tolkienite ideas like the Fae. Romantasy is a synthesis of romance tropes, supernatural urban fantasy works, and fan fiction tropes. These things, at least the last two, have some relation to Tolkien, but we're getting very, very distant now. We're getting very, very far away. And obviously, the main influence on romance on romantasy is romance, which is completely independent from Tolkien. So a foreign influence for the first time has really crashed into fantasy from the outside for the first time since basically the genre has become a thing. Because before Tolkien, there was fantasy. There was like a full generation of fantasy before Tolkien. But in terms of like pure secondary world fantasy, it was quite uncommon until Tolkien came along. Like the daughter of the King of Elfland, or whatever that book is. Like books like that, brilliant fantasy works, but they're still set in England, and you just kind of wander into the land of Elfland, like by going the wrong direction in Shropshire or whatever. However, romantasy can't erect a new kind of center of fantasy because it's highly divisive and is known to be highly divisive. I was suggesting that, romantasy probably is now like the dominant force in fantasy, but from people who don't like romantasy, they really don't like romantasy, much more than people who don't like Tolkien or Lord of the Rings don't like Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is regarded as kind of stuffy, old-fashioned, or overly descriptive, while romantasy is regarded by people outside of romantasy as just crap, as can be seen in the chat, as people who basically doubted that romantasy is literature at all. Which, of course, like, I'm not a romantasy respecter in any way. But yeah, people aren't respecting Elfsmart here, and they won't respect it elsewhere. Attacks on romanticy, which any explicit description has to be... What? All right. So attempts to deconstruct romanticy are regarded negatively because the idea is that romanticy is well under attack. That romanticy is constantly under attack, and it gets people get quite resentful when you're attacking romanticy because they're like, of course we all hate romanticy, even though of course people say that we all hate romanticy, but that can't be the case. But depending on what we means, because again, it's enormously successful. I think it's. People are discussing in this chat. I think the romanticy is complete shit too. But as the high and mighty podcast, I'm just giving kind of a non-normative account of romanticy. The unfinished nature of A Song of Ice and Fire and the shit end of the show means that it can't be the new founding text either. I don't really see A Song of Ice and Fire being completed. I think the next book will be released, whether by George Morton or after his death, will be put together. But if the series is finished, it'll be finished by someone else, and I don't think that can really become like a new founding text if that happens. Brandon Sanderson, I don't think will ever have mainstream appeal. It's far too obviously geeky. Like, I imagine a Mistborn show or a Stormlight show could be popular among like anime fans or whatever, but I don't see it ever going genuinely mainstream. I don't think your mum is ever going to watch Mistborn or Stormlight or anything like this. As is often the case in our moment, the new centre of fantasy will be nothing and everything. The real deconstruction we have going on is the structural dissolution of the genre of fantasy. The centre of fantasy will no longer be a series like Lord of the Rings, even if a half-read one, but rather will be an indistinct web of notions spread virally in a dialectical relationship between fan fiction and published fiction. We have a problem, or maybe not a problem, maybe it's a fact, where fan fiction and published literature are becoming increasingly closer together. They're becoming less and less separate. Fan fiction authors become published authors, and they don't feel any need to hide this. You often have published authors who just leave up their AO3 page. I've even seen I've even seen authors do like auto fan fiction. These tropes are getting closer and closer together, and you're starting to see on works of published fiction, like genre conventions of, not just genre conventions of fan fiction, but methods of marking out. So online fiction, in terms of fan fiction and other sort of things, is tagged. It's tagged with things like happy ending. I think this is kind of some of the kind of most gripping and kind of mind-bending stuff about this new generation of works, is that they'll be tagged with things like happy ending. They'll spoil the ending at the very beginning. They'll tell you explicitly who ends up with who. And this is blurring into published fiction, where you'll open the front page of a romance or romantasy or urban fantasy romance book, and they'll tell you the same things as they would in fantasy. They'll tell you like, this is the level of smut, this is the level of pornography, this is the level of happiness at the ending, this person ends up with that person. And often these are framed. You like wokeify this and justify this by portraying them as content warnings. So if you portray it as having a happy ending, then you can portray this as like a content warning, or you can say like you can portray the level of pornography by portraying it as a content warning, as opposed to just an indication of the reason someone might want to pick it up. Spencer asked, have you ever read W.H. Auden's review of Tolkien? No, but I'm going to open a tab to do that later. Yes, I've talked about this before. I've got an essay published on subversion talking about the return of the fan fiction as a return of the oral tradition, basically that the literature of kind of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century was this kind of brief aberration in human history where we lost this kind of structure of peer-to-peer fiction, of this evolving, changing fiction, not particularly owned by anyone, but still, possibly highly profitable. But of course, that just because we're returning to how things were before modernity, in our post-modernity, doesn't mean that this thing is better. We can have a return, we can rev turn, as the reactionaries say, and things can be bad, it can be worse, and so on and so on. I mean, that's cool. I mean, that's kind of like June, where June uses the omniscient narrator to be like, and then the traitor entered the room, But I think having the kind of bravery to do that with an omniscient narrator is very different than putting tags at the beginning of a work. Fantasy will become an increasingly spread out notion and one that is increasingly driven by micro marketing. That fantasy was something that you'll assert about a certain work when you want to convince people to read it, when particular micro influencers want to convince people to read it. Again, in some ways, this is a return to pre-genre fiction, where there were simply some stories which included fantastical elements. That's the thing with romantasy. I mentioned that, a lot of contemporary fantasy, grimdark especially, could just be literary fiction set in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think something is relatively similar for romantasy, where romantasy is basically like warlord romance in a large part. It's like, yeah, it's warlord romance. The only kind of fantastical element is that the warlord is also like 7 foot tall and impossibly, well, I won't go into the details of what he impossibly is, but I'm sure you can imagine. Yeah. No matter how much it's deconstructed, the Lord of the Rings will remain the grand old man of fantasy. And if we get tired of deconstructing, it will still never be forgotten. We should instead worry for the current state of literature, as fantasy will be worse off without a great text like Lord of the Rings being the foundational text, which all fantasy readers read, which all fantasy authors read. Decline is not inevitable. Unlike what happens in Lord of the Rings, decline is not inevitable. We have a chance for an immense flowering of literature as the barriers to publishing collapse. The issue is that no barrier to entry means that things slip down to the lowest common denominator. Someone like Brandon Sanderson, who's very much he's still from this before age, he's still from this before time. There still hasn't really been a big author who's come after Sanderson, even though Sanderson was published 20 years ago, and he kind of became very famous 10 to 15 years ago. His sentence work is terrible. Like, I tried to read the latest Stormlight Archive, and it was so horribly bad sentence to sentence. And it's obviously, me growing as a reader or whatever. But it was shocking. It was really shocking. And I think he is becoming worse. And part of him becoming worse is that he's escaping editorial control. And that is the way that Brandon Sanderson is like fanfiction authors. And he's like online publishing, online fiction authors. Because they're all escaping from editorial control. Editorial control is disappearing. And it turns out editorial control is actually very good. It's a very useful thing to have. I'm just going to review. Well, this is the last slide. But I'll review the comments. And of course, if anyone has any questions, now time to ask. Underhill is going to save it, but I think it here is music. 75% through a triple album folk narrative. I feel like there's a real shocking lack of like narrative fantasy music. Because also like when the works that do exist are like enormously popular on YouTube and other places, but then it doesn't seem that anyone wants to make more of it. Really, it's like one of the few niches that seem unfilled. Obviously, it will be filled with AI, which is I assume what you were discussing, but AI is still pretty crap, especially for the actual singing. I mean, it's funny. Soon says when people use AI to just get it to write the level of smart and balance they want. Obviously, you can. You can pretty easily jailbreak especially that Chinese bot that I forget the name of, DeepSeek. But from the mainstream ones, they ban all that stuff. They oppress you. They repress you. They stop you from producing elf pornography on ChatGPT. They stop you from producing violence. And all these kind of mainstream models will always do this. Because they're immensely concerned. Basically, the only thing that they have to do, they don't really care about a bot misinforming people or whatever, as long as it's not plausibly telling them, as long as it doesn't incite them towards doing something which is harmful. And harmful is a very wide distinction. They don't care, but they do care about like violence and sex and all this stuff. And we're coming like people are, especially on TikTok and whatever, people will read these absolutely horrors, violent pornographic books, but then because of the censorious nature of big corporations, they'll refer to it in these absolutely ridiculous ways on TikTok or whatever, because these words are banned, or often these words aren't banned, but people think they are, or they aren't banned, but they're not algorithmically favored. Which is a really funny thing, right? Because people will be like, oh, I need to talk about my horrible cannibal murder elf smut in such a way as that it won't be algorithmically disfavored. But it's like, why do a million people need to listen to you talk about that? Why couldn't you just be content with your 1,000 other freaks? I think that's the problem with TikTok compared to something like Facebook or Reddit or Tumblr. It's like a full panopticon where everyone is with everywhere all the time. There aren't like little groups and sections and so on. It's just a total world all the time. And everyone feels the need, for whatever reason, to have their freak shit broadcasted to as many people as they possibly can. There's lots of AI porn out there, but the ChatGPT guys really don't want you to do that. They don't want you to be jailbreaking their models and doing that to them. True. That is true. That AI porn is enormously inefficient because you can generate a picture of a boob using 100 kilowatts of energy, or you can just type boob into Google and get 1 trillion result. And even if you want a description of a boob, you can also type boob story into Google and get 1 million results. Aren't we all? I mean, yeah, I mean, you just kind of have to take the slop as it comes. You have to get slopped out. I mean, the good thing about the slop era and the barriers to publication coming down is that good stuff, does get published. I was going to talk about Second Apocalypse. I don't know if anyone's read that by, is it John Baker? The Second Apocalypse series, which I've recently been. I read the first few books a long time ago, but I stopped because they're incredibly, unrelentingly, terribly, terribly, horribly, horribly grim books. The only book series I think which is genuinely really grimdark, grimdark in the sense that comfy fantasy is comfy. Grimdark isn't normally completely brutal and horrible throughout. The Second Apocalypse series by John Baker is genuinely brutally and horrible throughout the whole thing. Every single person in it, apart from two, are damned to hell. And it seems quite reasonable that they're damned to hell. But I bring this all up because John Baker's work is again like, horrible murder, cannibalism stuff, but also fascinatingly philosophically deep. And it's good that stuff like that can be published. It's just for every one horrible and publishable stuff, which is also immensely intelligent and well made, there's 100 or there's 1,000 of the opposite of total horrible slop, which previously would have been stopped from ever reaching our ears by publishers and editors and so on. And the problem with slop being published is that slop creates more slop, that people read slop and they want to write slop and they want to read more slop. They want, with progression fantasy, the genre, there's a lot of demand for just the lowest common denominator stuff. This new genre, lit RPG, where you literally have like the numbers on the screen. It's like, instead of like at least having the thing of being like, and then the hero became more powerful, they literally tell you, he's level 4 now. He's level 80,000 in sword swinging. And you're like, oh, that's 40% higher than before. So sick. You're literally just getting horny over an author increasing in number. It's like you're sitting watching someone on a chalkboard, and they like write the number 8 down, and then they scribble it off, and they write 100, and you're like, oh my fucking god. That's basically what lit RPG is. Underhill says, yeah, what does AI have on Googling boob? It doesn't have anything. It's pathetic and terrible compared to that. But still, we're fascinated by it. I don't really know why. I think maybe because we all feel this creative drive, and it feels that when we make AI stuff, we're being more creative than we ever would when we Google boob. Yes, but it's not just going to be the AI. It's going to be us. We are also going to suffer model collapse as we just circle slop at each other. And of course, like AI will participate in this deconstruction. And the particularly brilliant bit is, as humans become stupider and stupider, presumably so will the AI models. Because even when, the AI has to be stopped from looking at itself because it becomes infinitely stupid. But if humans are becoming infinitely stupid, then presumably the same will happen to ChatGPT because it won't have any of the source material. Yeah, I think basically AI is kind of driven on by novelty and basically hoping that it'll get better. I'll often I talk to AI bots like intermittently. I'll talk to them. I'll be like, this is crap, this is terrible, this is not what I wanted. And then a few weeks will pass and I'll be like, I mean, they're not that bad, are they? Like, I could talk to them about this. Like, I'm sure they'll be able to, like, pretend to be a Jedi good or whatever. And then you talk to them and you're like, no, you're still a fucking idiot. So I think it's novelty and hope, because as a concept, it's amazing, that I can type at the machine and it can reply almost like a human. And I can do whatever. But when the actual result remains so mediocre, unless you've already enormously lowered your standards, you give up on it. No. I remember when they first kind of came out, For the first like 1 or 2 years it came out, I didn't ever use AI novels. The only thing I would use them for is when a new one would come out, I'd go and try and trick it about Nietzsche, and they would all never be very easily tricked about like high school misinterpretations of Friedrich Nietzsche. As in, you'd be like, oh, what did Nietzsche think of mass morality? They'd be like, oh, he's an advocate of mass morality. Like, got you, fucking got you. Unless anyone has any more pressing questions, I will start arranging things to end the stream. Thank you everyone for another sad lecture from Stefan where he tells that everything's bad and horrible. I mean, it's not a sad lecture where Stefan tells you everything's bad and horrible. I really enjoy doing lectures where I tell you that everything's bad and horrible, but I do normally say that everything's bad and horrible. I should make a lecture about things that aren't bad and horrible. I mean, the one that I'm still the most proud of that I did was the lecture I did on June. June in the context of Oedipus. I might just redo that one at some point. I just redo that one at some point because that was before the era where I'd put the PowerPoint on the screen. Instead, I would just read off notes. I think it was worse for that, where you saw more of my face. That is the one thing I don't like. Like, I'm not so narcissistic as to feel the need to have like my entire face, like this much of my face. But like, if we could get maybe like something like not this, but like maybe the other way around. But there's actually you can't do it the other way around, like where the PowerPoint is like mostly here and I would be like there. Like that would be a fine size for me. But no, you either have this or you have that, which is not enough. Underhill says, your summation appears to be that fantasy which strays from the Tolkienist model represents a decline in the genre. No, or at least I would prefer that not to be the case. My suggestion would be that it would be good if we could properly subvert and deconstruct Lord of the Rings so that we could sublate the Lord of the Rings and create something better. But unfortunately, we've failed to do that. I don't think there are fantasy works which are at least unambiguously better than Lord of the Rings. And that's an unfortunate fact and indicates that, we need to take things in a different direction. But that the new direction that fantasy is going in now, in a genuinely new direction, is probably going to make things worse, not better. You never know. I think there will be better books, maybe not better than Lord of the Rings, but there'll be lots of very, very good books. But they will not be the most popular books. And we will have to search them out, Yes, that was such a good, it was great. Dune is Oedipal tragedy in the context of Friedrich Nietzsche. Fucking best one I've ever done. That was sick. Should just do that again. Yeah, everyone go now. Go to ChatGPT. Type in ChatGPT. Please sublate Lord of the Rings for me. Please re-emerge fantasy in a higher form. I'm sure the AI will be completely capable of managing that. Goodbye and good night.